There are no shortage of terrifying evil people who remain in prison for the crimes they committed, and some of those people honestly might just put the devil to shame. We are talking evil people and a lot of serial killers today, so buckle up folks. Here are the top 10 real prisoners who are too evil for hell. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Kenneth Bianchi. The Hillside Strangler, which was later found out to be a pair of cousins working together, were Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. The two were charged and convicted for harming and taking the lives of 10 separate women together, with Kenneth taking the lives of 2 others on his own. After an extremely intensive investigation and the arrest of the two, Kenneth began trying to set up an insanity defense. He claimed dissociative identity disorder. He blamed his alter ego Steve for the horrific multitude of crimes. Luckily, however, a court psychologist, Dr. Martin Orne, observed him and his behavior and found that his claims were untrue. After being presented with this finding, Kenneth agreed to plead guilty and testify against his cousin in exchange for leniency on his sentence. He still ended up being sentenced to life in prison, while his cousin got a sentence of life in prison without parole. While Angelo had a heart attack and passed in 2002, Kenneth still remains in prison. In our number 9 spot today, we have Warren Jeffs. Warren Jeffs is the president of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints, and is also serving a life plus 20-year sentence, which is exactly where he should be. His father was once the president of the cult, but when he passed, the position was passed on to Warren. As the new leader of the polygamous cult, he said that no one should even attempt to marry one of his father's widows, but just a few days later he himself married all of them except for 2, because one refused and then was banned from ever marrying anyone ever again, and the other ran away. If your marriage proposal causes someone to flee the cult that they're in, you're clearly not a very good person. Warren had the power to assign who would marry who, but he was also able to punish a man by taking his wives and children and assigning them to another man. As a man, you had to have at least 3 wives in order to get into heaven, they say, but the more wives, the more likely it would be that you got into heaven. In 2005, the Texas authorities conducted a raid and took legal custody of 416 children after someone called in and tipped them off about all of the horrible things that were happening at the ranch. In 2006, Warren was arrested for being the worst and is still serving his sentence. There is so much more to this case that we don't have time to cover, but there was a documentary released recently called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey, which I would fully recommend if you want to know more about this horrible person. In our number 8 spot today, we have Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led by Charles Manson, and he was a willing participant for the horrible Tate and LaBianca crimes that took place on August 9th and 10th, 1969. If you don't know about them, you can look them up, but just a warning that the events that took place on those nights were horrible, gruesome, and insanely unnecessary. In October of 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and extradited back to California. Once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts related to the killings that happened on those terrible nights. He originally received a death sentence, but it did end up being commuted to life in prison. But get this, you guys, he was able to release a book while in prison, and he got married, and through conjugal visits he was able to have 4 children. Thankfully, in 1996 they banned those kinds of visits for people serving life in prison, and in 2003 he did get divorced because his wife had met someone else, which, like, yeah, I would hope so. He also apparently is now a devout Christian, which is just interesting. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Golden State Killer. If you have any interest in true crime at all, you have most definitely heard of the Golden State Killer, as he was one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and he managed to elude police for 30 years. From 1973 to 1986, the GSK was responsible for taking the lives of 13 people, harming 50, and 120 different burglaries all across California. Throughout the investigation process, he used different tactics to both taunt and threaten police and victims, which is just on another level of messed up. If you don't know how this story ends, buckle up because it is absolutely wild. So you know those family DNA tests, like those 23andMe things where you send in your DNA and then they send you back your genealogy? Well, basically these services helped identify who the real GSK was. In 2018, when Detective Paul Holmes, shout out to MFM if you know you know, and FBI lawyer Steve Kramer uploaded the GSK DNA profile that they were able to obtain from the crime scenes to the website GED Match, they were able to find 10 to 20 people who had the same great-great-great-grandparents as the match. From there, a genealogist made a large family tree, and then they were able to single out two main suspects. After covertly connecting DNA samples from one of the suspects and comparing them to the crime scene DNA, they were finally able to arrest Joseph James DeAngelo, who is the Golden State Killer. After decades of waiting, the victims of his crimes were finally able to see justice served as he was sentenced to 12 life sentences plus 8 years. He was spared the death penalty because he admitted to numerous crimes he had perpetrated, some of which he wasn't even being charged for. He is now 75 years old and he will most certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. In our number 6 spot today we have James Holmes. James is the man behind the 2012 Aurora, Colorado shooting that took the lives of 12 people and injured 70 others in the Century 16 movie theater. Shortly after the crime spree, he was arrested and held without bail while he awaited trial on an accepted plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. I just want to make it clear in this case that insanity doesn't apply to every mental illness, of course. James was and is severely mentally ill, but the court has the job of deciding whether or not that illness made him unable to tell right from wrong. That's what the defense had to prove. Things were admitted to the court, such as his notebooks and journals, as well as testimony from two separate psychologists who spent 22 and 25 hours with him, and both diagnosed him with a serious mental illness, but both also stated that in their professional opinion, he knew right from wrong. After a really tumultuous trial, he ended up being found guilty. The jury could have given him a death sentence, but on account of his illness, they decided that that would be inappropriate, so in the end instead he was sentenced to 12 life sentences without parole and in an additional 3,318 years. In our number 5 spot today we have Charles Ng. Charles' story really starts off shortly after he moved to the United States on a student visa. He dropped out after his first semester and soon after he was involved in a hit-and-run accident. He then tried to avoid prosecution by enlisting in the United States Marine Corps using false documents that stated his birthplace was within the United States. He was later arrested by military police a year later for stealing automatic weapons, and then somehow he escaped custody, headed back toward Northern California, and this is where he met Leonard Lake, who is another real piece of work. Charles did end up going away and serving a bit of time, but it was only 18 months and he was back with Leonard, and that is when the two started their crime spree together. It is believed that together the pair took the lives of somewhere from 11 to 25 different people. When Leonard was caught and brought in for questioning, he sneakily took a cyanide pill he had hidden in his jacket and took his own life, but Charles ended up standing trial. He was convicted for 11 of the killings and he remains on death row at San Quentin. In our number 4 spot today we have Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. This is a double whammy because unfortunately both of these people are still alive, but at least one of them, Paul, is still in jail. This horrible pair are often referred to as the Ken and Barbie killers, and while Paul started off living a life of crime, he quickly brought Karla into it as well after their meeting. That is not to say she is not just as guilty as him, however, because they are both fully responsible for their own actions. While Paul was arrested for a multitude of crimes, the pair were arrested and convicted of taking the lives of 3 separate people, one of them being Karla's own sister. See what I mean about them both being responsible for their own crimes? They both suck. The investigation into the crimes proved to be quite difficult, with authorities having plenty of hoops to jump through, and this is why a plea deal was created for Karla. She had 1 week to accept or decline the deal, which would give her a sentence of 12 years for her full cooperation. She accepted. Both were convicted in 2005, and Paul was up to apply for parole in 2018, and in October of that year he was denied. His next parole hearing was just over a year ago on June 22nd of 2021, and it took only an hour of deliberation to decide to turn down that application as well. I personally think 30 seconds probably would have been enough to decide, but I'm just glad the outcome was the same. Karla, on the other hand, served her 12-year sentence and then was released. like years ago. She moved away from Canada and headed to Costa Rica for a while with her new husband and children, if you can believe that, but unfortunately she has since returned. In our number 3 spot today we have Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is an American killer who is convicted for taking the lives of 10 people, including his paternal grandparents, as well as his own mother. It is said that he is noted for his height, as he is 6 foot 9 inches, and for his intelligence, as he apparently has an IQ of 145, but I personally think he is most notable for being an absolute monster. His first crime took place when he took the lives of his grandparents, and after this crime he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent time in a hospital before it was determined that he was rehabilitated and he was released at the age of 21. After his release, he unfortunately went on a spree where he would target young females who were hitchhiking. After his final crimes, he ended up confessing and turning himself in, which is something we really don't see all of the time. When asked in an interview why he confessed, he said, quote, "The original purpose was gone. It wasn't serving any physical or real or emotional purpose. It was just a pure waste of time." 3 court-appointed psychiatrists examined and observed him and found him to be legally sane, and thus he was able to stand trial. On November 8, 1973, the jury deliberated for just 5 hours before returning with a verdict of guilty. He has been eligible for parole since 1979 and has been denied every time he applied, one time saying, quote, "Society is not ready in any shape or form for me. I can't fault them for that." He is eligible to apply for parole again next in 2024. In our number 2 spot today we have Stephen Griffiths. This is a person who is said to have idolized the Yorkshire Ripper, so I'm sure what comes next will be no surprise. Stephen was a PhD student who wanted to achieve fame, but through the most sinister way possible. Between June 2009 and May of 2010, he would go on to take the lives of 3 separate women. His criminal history was also extremely concerning, as years ago he had been arrested due to an unprovoked attack on a grocery store manager, and it is said that he previously stated that he saw himself becoming a serial killer. Shortly after he was arrested for his crimes, CCTV footage emerged that shows him celebrating after taking the life of his final victim. The footage showed him holding up a crossbow and giving the finger directly to the camera. It is said that Stephen pled guilty to his crimes once caught, not because he was remorseful, but because he wanted to receive the recognition for them. In our number 1 spot today we have Joanna Dennehy. This is a person responsible for a series of killings and attacks that took place in March 2013. Joanna is a very cold and heartless person and has, on many occasions, been said to laugh at her crimes and the lives she took, even still behind bars. After the first of her crimes, authorities launched a manhunt for her and they used CCTV footage to help track her down. She was finally caught after attacking 2 dog walkers who, thanks to immediate medical intervention, were able to survive. There are many things about this story that make it exceptionally chilling, and it seems as though most people Joanna encounters are left with quite an impression of what a horrible person she is. On the day she was sentenced, it is reported that the judge, Mr. Justice Spencer, said, quote, "Although you pleaded guilty, you've made it clear you have no remorse." He went on to say, quote, "You are a cruel, calculating, selfish, and manipulative serial killer." After this, he sentenced her to a whole life order, or life in prison without parole, and it is said that she smiled and laughed at this. Since her time in prison, she is said to have planned escape attempts that involved the killing of a prison guard and other terrifying ideas. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thanks so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye!